So, let's begin by considering what economy is. Fundamentally, the purpose of economy is to produce things that people need, whether in the form of material goods or services. Even animals have an economy of sorts. In animal species, economy simply consists in the combined actions of individuals trying to fulfill their needs. First of all, their need for food, as well as things like territory and mating. For most species, this occurs on an individualistic level, but some, for instance ants, have highly cooperative systems where the actions of individuals are meant to benefit the collectivity rather than the individual itself. High levels of cooperativeness seem to have arisen in humans roughly 2 million years ago, and it is this cooperativeness that has enabled humans to become the dominant species on the planet. In primitive societies, hunters would cooperate to take down large prey, and more generally, an entire tribe would cooperate in the form of people sharing their production, whether it be hunted or gathered food or created tools or textiles, with all the members of the tribe. Because everyone knew what everyone else was up to, there was little need for the kind of formal economic structures that are currently in place. All you needed was order to enforce proper distribution of goods among the members of the tribe. In more recent times, bartering became a frequent method for the exchange of goods between tribes. Bartering involves directly exchanging one type of good for another without any currency serving as an intermediary. While this can work in primitive environments, with the advent of complex civilization, this is no longer possible. And that is because complex civilization implies specialization of work, and most individuals in a society have no direct need for the product of a specialized worker. If someone, say, produces parts for vehicles, only vehicle constructors and repairers will have use for those parts. A grocer has no need for them, and therefore a vehicle parts producer could not exchange its products for a grocer's food. As such, a vehicle parts producer could simply not survive in an economy that relied on barter. This is why the wish that some idealistic people have that we should get rid of money is ridiculous. Money perfectly solves the vehicle parts producer's problem of most people not being interested in its products. Money is a token symbolizing the worth of all products, and crucially, it applies to all products. So a vehicle constructor can give money, which it earned through vehicle sales, to the vehicle parts producer, and with that money, the vehicle parts producer can buy anything it wants, whether it be for personal use like food or professional use like machines that help produce the parts. Money is absolutely essential for a complex society and the high standards of living that depend on it. So now it's clear that we need a system that uses money, and it's also clear that everyone needs money to survive, barring direct donations of goods to the poor. Such donations of goods and of money is how people with no wealth and no income manage to survive. But that's an obviously imperfect solution. The basic principle of a typical society based on money is that since money is meant to symbolize the worth of things, whether goods or services, including in the form of employed labor, one needs to sell things in order to be able to earn money. If you have no means of selling things, and nobody just gave you money for nothing, then you have no money. In a small tribe, this was not an issue. Everyone who could work would work out of social pressure, and those who couldn't work would typically still be given what they needed. But in a large impersonal society, this no longer works. Despite the population being larger, individuals are more on their own. And this means that people now depend on an income which they obtain from selling things, whether it be material objects, services, or their own labor, which I'm going to collectively refer to as products. And of course, if we are to sell a product to someone, that means that that someone has to have money of its own, which it would have acquired by selling a product of its own. For the economy to function, we need people, in the form of consumers, to have money. And to have money, these consumers need to sell products, and thus be producers as well. As such, the system requires that a consumer also be a producer. But some people are not able to become producers, and this is a problem because we're all fundamentally consumers, if only because we need to consume food to survive. And so theoretically, if you cannot produce, you cannot consume, and thus you cannot survive. But even ignoring that aspect, it also means that you cannot help others make money by purchasing and consuming the things they produce. This is the issue of unemployment, and why high unemployment is a burden on the economy even if one doesn't consider the actual plight of unemployed individuals. And so quite bizarrely, the purpose of the economy is no longer to just produce things that people can consume, but also to allow them to consume by giving them money through their role as a producer. The purpose of the economy is to produce, yes, but also to give people a livelihood, to give them the means to consume what the economy produces. And when this fails, this results in unemployment. There are several ways of addressing unemployment. One is full employment, a government-guaranteed provision of employment for everyone. This is what socialists advocate for. Another, which prevailed in traditional societies, is to let unemployed people's survival depend on the goodwill of others to provide charity. A third, what redistributive capitalists support, is to institute a system of government-issued benefits to such people. Unfortunately, all three of these solutions are imperfect. The problem with full employment is that if a person is guaranteed a job which provides a living income, that person can get away with performing poorly. This is part of the reason why socialist-type economies tend to do poorly. The problem with charity is that it is unreliable and largely insufficient. People depending on charity don't lead decent lives. And that is unfair to the people who give to charity as opposed to those who don't. Charity is a tax on the generous. The problem with benefits is that it's unfair to low-paid workers who earn little more despite working for it, to the extent that many people will prefer to have somewhat lower income in exchange for not needing to work, and this then requires governments to investigate potential fraud. So all three of these solutions are problematic for the reasons mentioned above, and also for a reason shared by all three, namely that they practically make paid work obligatory for everyone. Because, like I said above, to be a consumer, you need to be a producer. Imagine a society where production efficiency was very high, so that people's needs for consumption could be satisfied by the production of only a small fraction of the population. In theory, everyone's needs could be satisfied by only having a small share of the population work. But the problem is that those who don't work don't have any money, which means they can't consume, and as such not only live in misery, but can't even pay the people who do produce and who are left with a surplus to share among producers. This state of affairs would necessitate the creation of useless production positions just so that people could earn the money that would allow them to consume. That's absurd, and yet that's how typical economies work. Luckily, there is a solution to this, and I will come back to it shortly, especially since it's a key component of my plan. Before that, I want to explore the different ways that a money-using economy can function. In the most simple form, you'd have individuals selling their products and buying other products in a free market and let the prices be set by the market. This is the liberal ideal. What happens in practice is consolidation of individual workers into companies. This is because the production of many types of goods requires the cooperation between multiple people, and because the principle of economy of scale makes the larger producer more competitive against the smaller one. As a result, most people end up being employees of a company rather than self-employed individuals. Because the owners of the companies benefit from paying their employees as little as possible, while at the same time employees are obliged to accept low wages as a result of insufficient competition between employers, employees often end up being compensated less than they would be in an idealized liberal economy. This observation is what gave rise to socialist movements which aimed to put the ownership of the means of production back in the hands of the workers so as to ensure their fair compensation. Now, Marx's vision of communism was something even highly distinct from socialism, involving rather an economy that was so efficient that anyone could take the goods it wanted, just like some people can now use water for free in countries where water is abundant. This is what is called a post-scarcity economy. Because there is no scarcity, because there is illimited abundance of everything people might want, people don't need money, they just take what they want. In practice, this is not a realistic notion, since there will always be things that we won't have in illimited abundance, such as real estate or maybe giant spaceships. If you let people just take things, some people would take entire planets and leave others with nothing at all. As such, we will always need money, or at least some kind of system that determines proper allocation of goods. Another aspect of Marxist communist society is that all necessary economic production would be carried out by machines so that nobody would be required to work. This aspect, on the other hand, is very much a possibility and is already starting to become partially feasible. But as a whole, Marx's idea of communism is not possible simply because we will never be able to provide an illimited amount of goods to everyone who might want them. It's important to note that Marx's idea of communism is immensely different from the systems that were instituted in places that have called themselves communist. Those systems were rather attempts at creating socialism, which never even properly succeeded in doing so. But the reason for that is because socialism in the strict sense is almost impossible as well. Socialism is a system prevailing where much economic production needs to be carried out by human labor as opposed to mechanized labor, as is the case with communism. In this system, all workers own the means of production, which is to say that all companies are owned equally by all those who work in them. While in theory this can seem like a good thing, in practice several problems quickly come up. Now, socialism has typically been associated with planned economies, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. A planned economy is the logical outcome of a system where all the workers are meant to have their say on all the economic output of their society. And this is indeed commonly, though not always, what socialism envisions. If all workers were to have their say, then they would have to vote on all decisions of economic production, which of course would take up more time than is feasible. As a result, the workers need to delegate the decision-making to certain people, which leads to a government bureaucracy of economic planning. Even supposing that the workers did have the time to decide on everything, having the workers make all the decisions is very problematic, because it will generally lead to scrapping the production of niche goods. If decisions for production are based on majority rule, and the majority is not interested in producing, say, skateboards, then skateboards won't be produced. And even if they do decide to produce them, they have no good way of knowing how many to produce so as to satisfy the demand. And of course, delegation doesn't change this problem. A seemingly good thing about government-controlled planned economies is that they can allow for full employment. The government can simply decide that there is a position for everyone and make each position be filled. But the problem with this is that, since everybody is guaranteed a position, there is little incentive to perform a good job. And forcing people to work is very coercive as well. So this is actually a drawback of such an economy. Now, another somewhat good aspect of government-controlled economies is that prices can be fixed so as to correct for the unfairly high prices that get generated in a capitalist system when a few privileged people have a stranglehold on certain goods, such as housing. This is definitely a good thing, and there isn't really an inherent associated drawback as long as it doesn't interfere with economic production. But that is indeed exactly what happens if you fix the prices of consumer goods. The reason price fixing for housing rentals is acceptable is because the homes already exist, and therefore fixing the prices of rentals doesn't interfere with the production of anything. Obviously, if the population grows, more housing can be built, but the amount can be determined by population registries. However, for consumer goods, demand is difficult to determine and can vary over time. In a free market, if people want more of something, then the sellers can afford to raise the price and still have people buy their product, which they will of course do. In other words, increased demand for a good increases the price of the good. And because the price is increased, this makes it profitable for the producers of the good to produce more of the good, thereby satisfying the increased demand for this good. This is how free markets are responsive to demand. If prices are fixed, however, as they typically are even for consumer goods in planned economies, none of this can happen, and it's not easily obvious to producers if demand has increased. Free markets are more efficient because businesses are always looking to fill vacant economic niches, and so consumer needs get fulfilled organically. Government-planned economies are going to necessarily remain much more crude than free markets, often leading to both useless surpluses and problematic shortages of certain goods. For instance, if in a certain town many people want to acquire a bicycle because they realize that the layout of the town lends itself to bicycle riding, bike shops in that town will see their sales grow, and this will lead them to buy more bikes from their suppliers and maybe open new outlets, or maybe incite the creation of new bike shop startups. In a planned economy, none of this is going to happen, and instead there will simply be a certain amount of bikes per sale per amount of people in each place. And so bike-averse places will have a useless surplus of bicycles, whereas bike-savvy ones will suffer from a deficit and some people who wanted one will be left without one. This illustrates why planned economies are inferior. Nonetheless, it would be mistaken to claim that such economies don't work at all, that they are failures. The Soviet Union and its satellite countries did overall enjoy sustained economic growth over quite a few decades. Much of the reason those countries are poorer is that they already were poorer when they first became planned economies. Western European countries that retained the free market had already been highly industrialized for a long time, while the countries further east were not. And the collapse of the Soviet Union was largely a result of economic stressors of kinds that affected free market economies as well. So though planned economies are overall less efficient, that doesn't mean that they don't work. And anyway, we can also imagine a system where the workers own the means of production in the absence of a planned economy. In this system, workers would work at specific companies and only get to weigh in on the decisions of their own company. These companies would necessarily sell their products in a free market just like in modern capitalist economies, but with workers all getting their share of the profits. It has to, by definition, be a free market in this case, because if it wasn't, it would be a planned economy. But here a new problem arises. Some companies will do better than others, to the point that some will go bankrupt. The employees of the latter are now left without a job. But other companies might not have a need for them, they might not benefit from taking them on. As a result, we're once again faced with the issue of unemployment as we are now, which was one of the issues that socialism was meant to correct. This could, of course, be corrected by the government forcing companies to take on unemployed workers, but then the issue of disincentive to work generated by guaranteed employment reappears. And another issue is that, since everyone is part owner of the company it works for, everyone should need to have a say on the management of the company. Management of a single company is already a big job. So if all workers had to manage the company they work for, they wouldn't have any time to work on anything else. They would be bogged down in endless meetings with all the other workers of the company. So in order to make the company function properly, they would need to select a few people to take care of most of the management work, as is the case in capitalist economies. It's the same principle of delegation for the sake of convenience that I said leads to government-planned economies when workers are supposed to manage the production of their entire society as opposed to only their company. Obviously, in both instances, ownership of the means of production would be more symbolic than anything, since workers wouldn't be even making the major decisions anymore. And again, to ensure efficiency, you'd have to be able to fire the slackers, which means that any worker only owned part of the company until it got fired. And of course, also to ensure efficiency, that firing would likely be decided by specialist managers, as is the case in capitalist economies. So you would largely end up with a system resembling capitalism anyway. Now, just from a perspective of time constraint, it would theoretically be possible to give all workers a say on what salaries to give everyone, and in smaller companies also whom to hire and whom to fire. The problem here, however, is that people could band together to cheat the system. You could have a majority of people forming an alliance that would vote to give its members higher salaries and immunity from being fired. And since they're a majority, there is nothing the others could do about it if decisions are based on majority vote. Those people could then stop working completely while continuing to pay themselves higher salaries, which would eventually lead to the company crashing, but which would still be beneficial to them personally as long as they could then find another job elsewhere. This issue, of course, also very much arises with majority rule in a democracy, which is why democracies need to have a strong constitution to prevent this, and even better, comprise a majority of people who are truly well-intentioned. To prevent the kind of scenario I described above, you need a large set of rules to prevent such cheating, which implies government interference in businesses, and which is another explanation for why societies that tried to be socialist ended up being government-controlled. Worker-owned socialist economies are unstable and inevitably switch to either capitalist-type economies or government-controlled economies. Modern China could be considered a mix of both, since people can get fired and prices are largely set by the market, but the government retains ownership of much of production. This system typically gets called state capitalism, and it doesn't functionally much differ from a private capitalist system, beyond the fact that owners of big companies are members of the state instead of private individuals. It has the same advantages of private capitalism, namely incentive to work and responsiveness to demand, and the same drawbacks, especially economic inequality and unpaid unemployment. But the advantages outweigh the drawbacks overall, so that China's economic productivity has strongly increased since transitioning from a state-planned economy to a state-capitalist one. In summary, communism is impossible, socialism is unstable, and planned economies with guaranteed employment are rather inefficient. The most efficient modern systems are capitalism, whether of the private or state kind. I'm not going to concern myself with other ancient economic systems, which in any case could largely be considered variants of capitalism or socialism. Now, this might come as a disappointment to those frustrated with the unfairness of the capitalist system and hoping to replace it with something better. But don't worry. I'm glad to say that there actually very much is a solution to ensure fairness within a capitalist system. And this solution is also the solution to unemployment that I mentioned at the beginning.